Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating and honestly pretty counterintuitive idea about education. You see, we all want students to be critical thinkers, right? To solve problems and navigate this complex world. And you'd think the obvious answer is, well, just teach them those skills directly. But we're going to explore why that approach might be the very thing holding them back, and what the science is a much more powerful way to go.
I mean, let's be real. This is the one thing everyone agrees on. We want students to think deeply, to solve tricky problems, to collaborate. These are the skills we hear about constantly, the ones everyone says are absolutely essential for the future.
But here's the twist, the central paradox we're looking at today. What if this frantic push to teach so-called generic skills is totally backfiring? What if the real key to unlocking critical thinking, creativity, all of it, lies somewhere else entirely? That's the big question we're digging into.
And look, this focus on skills isn't just some small trend. It's a huge deal. You have major players like the World Economic Forum putting out lists just like this one, outlining these 21st century skills. And right there, under competencies, you see it. Critical thinking, problem solving, creativity. And education systems all over the world have basically rewired their entire approach to try and teach these things directly.
And yet, something is seriously wrong. The data, well, it tells a completely different story. Even with this massive global push for skills, things like reading comprehension and science scores have actually been going down in many of the world's most developed countries. So we've got to ask the question, if we're teaching skills more than ever before, why are the results getting worse? This right here is the paradox of skills.
Okay, so to crack this paradox, we have to pop the hood and take a look at our own wiring. It turns out the answer isn't really in education theory, but in cognitive science, in the basic way that our brains are built to think and learn. So think of your brain as having two really important memory systems. First, you've got your working memory. Imagine it's like a tiny little workbench right at the front of your mind. It's where you juggle new information, but it is incredibly limited. It can only hold maybe 4 to 7 new things at once and for less than 20 seconds before they just poof, disappear. But then you have your long-term memory, and that's not a workbench. It's a massive, sprawling warehouse with a seemingly limitless capacity where knowledge can be stored forever.
Now, the relationship between that tiny workbench and that giant warehouse is everything, and it's captured perfectly in this one classic experiment. Researchers got a group of expert chemists and a group of novices, and they showed them two chemical equations. One was a totally legitimate, real equation. The other was a fake. It used all the right symbols, but they were just scrambled into a meaningless order. And they only had 30 seconds to memorize each one.
The results were just staggering. The novices, as you'd expect, tried to memorize both equations symbol by symbol. Of course, this totally overloaded their little workbench, their working memory, and they made tons of mistakes. But the experts, they saw that real equation completely differently. They reached into their long-term memory warehouse, and they didn't see a string of symbols. They saw one single, meaningful chunk. This is called chunking, and it frees up a ton of space on that mental workbench, which is what allows them to do the hard work of actual thinking.
And this just lays bare the core principle. Knowledge isn't the opposite of skill. Knowledge is the engine of skill. The more you have stored in that long-term memory warehouse, the more you can chunk new information, and that frees up your working memory to do the cool stuff, like thinking critically and solving problems. It really is true. Knowledge begets knowing.
But, this isn't just about doing better on a test or becoming an expert chemist. The stakes here are actually way bigger. This is about the fundamental health of our democratic societies.
I mean, listen how seriously some countries take this. This is from the Norwegian parliament back in 1994. They understood that for a democracy to actually work, its citizens have to have some shared knowledge, a common frame of reference. Without it, we can't really communicate or even debate the big issues. And that gap, they argued, leads directly to social inequality.
The educator E.D. Hirsch gave this a name. He called it cultural literacy. It's all that background stuff, the words, the concepts, the history, that writers and speakers just assume their audience already knows. And when schools don't bother to build this shared knowledge, it's the most disadvantaged kids who suffer the most, because they often rely on school to get it.
Just think about it. Take a pretty standard sentence you might see in the news, like this one. To really get what's being said here, to have an opinion, to participate in the conversation, you need to know what climate summits are. what kind of aid they're talking about, the history of these negotiations, the science behind it, all of it. Without that background knowledge, you're not just uninformed, you're effectively locked out of the debate.
So, if we agree that knowledge is the engine of skill and the bedrock of a functioning democracy, how in the world do we actually build it? Well, the answer lies in an approach called a knowledge-rich curriculum. And it's all about getting the best of both worlds.
You see, for years, education has been swinging on this crazy pendulum. On one extreme, you have old-school curricula, like this one from Belgium in 1954, that can sometimes feel like just a giant list of facts to memorize. But then the pendulum swings all the way to the other side, and you get modern curricula, like this one from Wales, that are so obsessed with vague skills that you can't even tell what a student is supposed to actually know by the end of the year.
A knowledge-rich curriculum tries to stop that pendulum in the middle. It's built on 3 really simple but powerful pillars. 1, it has to be content-rich, deliberately teaching knowledge that takes students beyond their day-to-day experience. 2, it has to be coherent, building that knowledge up logically, piece by piece. And 3, it needs to be clear, with specific, well-defined goals.
Let's just zoom in on coherence for a second, because it's so important. This isn't just about a random collection of facts. Vertical coherence means that what a kid learns in 3rd grade history actually sets them up for what they'll learn in 4th grade. Horizontal coherence means that when they're studying the Roman Empire and history, they're also learning about its geography in geography class. It all connects, and it respects that thinking like a scientist is just different than thinking like a historian.
And let me be really clear here. This is not about cramming kids' heads with more random facts. In fact, it's the exact opposite of those curricula that are a mile wide and an inch deep. The whole point is to be really selective, to choose the most critical, the most powerful knowledge, and then build it into a deep, rich, interconnected web that students can draw on for the rest of their lives.
Okay, this all sounds really good in theory, right? It makes sense. But this is the million-dollar question. Does it actually work? What does the evidence say happens when you put this into practice in real schools with real kids?
Well, a recent, truly landmark study gives us a pretty incredible answer. It looked at a network of schools using a knowledge-rich approach called core knowledge. And here's the brilliant part. Because these schools were so popular, they had to use a lottery for admissions. Researchers could compare the kids who won the lottery and got in with the kids who lost the lottery and didn't. That's the gold standard for this kind of research. And they followed these kids for up to 7 years.
So, the results? Absolutely remarkable. The students in the knowledge-rich schools gained a massive 16 percentile points in reading and English compared to their peers. Now, to put that into perspective, a jump that big would be enough to launch a country like the US from being average into the top 5 worldwide on international reading tests. It's a huge effect.
But this might be the most important finding of all. The impact on equity was unbelievable. In one of the low-income schools they studied, the notorious achievement gaps between different groups of students, they weren't just narrowed, they were completely erased, gone, in reading, math, and science. And that leads us to a pretty profound conclusion. It suggests that systematically and carefully building a foundation of shared knowledge, starting from the very first day of school, might just be one of the single most powerful tools we have to close achievement gaps and create a more equitable education system for every single child.
Which brings us right back to the beginning and leaves us with the most important question of all. If knowledge is this powerful, if it underpins our skills, our ability to communicate, and even our democracy, then the real debate isn't if knowledge matters. Of course it does. The real debate is this: what shared knowledge is so absolutely essential that we as a society decide we cannot and will not leave its transmission to chance? That's the question I'll leave you with. Thanks for watching.